Woman's temper ain't fit for a wife.
You asked for honesty. I gave it.
The Rejection, Red Willow, Arizona Territory, March 1878. The noon train exhaled steam that hung like ghosts above the platform. Rain slid off the eaves of the depot, steady and cold, the kind that darkened every board of the station till it looked carved from sorrow itself. Eleanor Wade stepped down last. Her boots found the mud with a soft, defeated sound. A gray trunk waited behind her, scuffed by the long miles from Philadelphia. She had come west with letters full of promises, a husband waiting a home, a start worth believing in. But the man who had written those letters, Mr. Harland Pryce, stood with his hat pressed to his chest and eyes full of judgment. "She's not what I was told," he said to the station master, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "The woman's temper ain't fit for a wife." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her trunk. "You read my letters, Mr. Pryce," she answered, voice steady though her cheeks burned. "You asked for honesty. I gave it." He turned from her as though her words were smoke. "Then you'll find honesty. Don't buy comfort out here. Keep the fare money, I won't be taking her." Laughter rose from a knot of onlookers, a few ranch hands, a woman in a bonnet whispering behind her glove. The train hissed again, a long exhale that sounded too much like pity. Eleanor did not cry. She bent, lifted the trunk herself, and walked toward the edge of the platform. Rain gathered on her lashes and ran down like tears she refused to shed. Across the yard, a man watched from his horse. Ethan Hale had ridden in with the freight wagons that morning, delivering supplies to the general store. He was a tall shape under a black oilskin coat face, half shadowed by a hat slick with rain. The way the woman moved, stiff-spined, proud, even in disgrace, caught something inside him that had been quiet too long. He swung down from the saddle. The horse shook its mane, scattering drops. By the time he reached the depot steps, Eleanor had set her trunk beneath the awning and stood staring at the empty track as if the rails might carry her back to the life she'd lost. "Ma'am," Ethan said softly. She turned, startled eyes the color of stormlight. "You'll want to keep out of the rain." "I'm fine," she said, though her hands trembled. "Seems I'm not welcome under any roof in this town." Ethan's gaze flicked toward the saloon balcony where Harland Pryce had already disappeared. "That one don't speak for Red Willow." "Does he speak for decency?" she asked. A muscle worked in Ethan's jaw. Not today. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the patter of rain on tin. He took off his hat and let the water run through his hair. "Name's Ethan Hale. I got a wagon heading out past the creek. There's a dry cabin till the storm quits. I don't take charity. Didn't offer any." He nodded toward the trunk. "But if you aim to drag that thing through mud, you'll be needin' a miracle or a mule." Her mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile that never made it past her eyes. "And which are you?" "Neither," he said. "Just someone who hates watchin' a soul freeze for pride." The words landed somewhere she couldn't guard. She studied him, the line of his shoulders, the scar beneath his cheekbone, the steadiness in his eyes. He wasn't handsome in the way Eastern men were. He looked carved from dust and patience. Finally, she nodded. "One night. Till the rain stops." He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing, set it in the wagon, then offered a hand. She hesitated before taking it. His palm was warm despite the cold. As they left the depot, townsfolk pretended not to stare. The wheels rolled through puddles that mirrored the gray sky. For a while they rode without speaking. The sound of rain on canvas filled the air, a slow heartbeat between them. Eleanor sat straight, eyes on the horizon. "You shouldn't have interfered. People will talk." "People always do," he said. "Do you even know who I am?" He glanced over. "A woman who didn't deserve what happened back there." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's a truth." She looked away, hiding the quiver in her throat. The road wound out of town past the red willow trees that gave the place its name. Their branches bowed under rain, shedding crimson leaves into the swollen ditch. Ethan guided the horse carefully, the rein steady in his hands. "You from the east?" he asked. "Philadelphia. Long way for disappointment." Her breath hitched. "I thought marriage would mean a life with purpose. Maybe you were just headed the wrong direction." They rode on until the land opened to the plain. Grass bent under rain, and in the distance the mountains blurred into gray mist. A flash of lightning crawled across the sky, far but bright. Ethan pointed toward a low ridge. "Cabins over there. Belonged to my brother once. He's gone now. What happened to him?" "War took him first. Regret finished the job." She studied him quietly. "You speak as if you knew that kind of loss." He didn't answer, only urged the horse faster. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had seeped into the clouds. Smoke from the chimney told her someone had been here recently. He struck a match, lit the fire anyway. The light crawled across the wooden walls, gold against shadow. "Set your things by the stove," he said. "Ain't much, but it's dry." Eleanor stepped inside the floor, creaking beneath her boots. The air smelled of pine and smoke. For the first time that day, she let herself breathe. He poured water into a tin kettle, then looked at her across the glow. "You hungry? I'm tired," she said. "Of trains. Of men who think they can send a woman back like wrong-ordered goods." He nodded once. "Reckon the West's full of wrong men and right dust. Takes time to tell which is which." Her laughter surprised them both, short, cracked, but real. Outside, the rain thickened, beating against the roof in waves. Ethan moved to shut the door, pausing as thunder rolled over the plains. "You can stay till morning," he said. "After that, decide where your trail runs." She met his gaze. "And you, why help me?" He looked into the fire, voice low. "Guess I saw a flame I'd forgotten mattered." The rain answered for them, soft and endless. Somewhere, a horse stamped, restless in the dark. Eleanor sat near the hearth, warming her hands, and wondered if every journey that failed was only leading her here. The offer. The rain didn't let up through the night. It came steady, whispering against the roof like some weary hymn the sky refused to stop singing. Each drop carried the scent of wet cedar, and smoke a rhythm older than forgiveness. Eleanor woke before dawn. The fire had burned low, a red eye blinking through the ashes. Ethan was still in the chair by the door hat, tipped low rifle leaned within reach. His boots were muddy, his coat damp, but he hadn't moved. He'd sat there through the night, watching over her like some silent sentinel carved from patience and weather. She watched him for a moment, the way his chest rose slow and quiet, the faint shadow of beard roughening his jaw. The lines around his mouth softened when he slept. She wondered what kind of man kept watch for a stranger in a storm. Outside, the world breathed mist. The hills were only shapes, soft and uncertain, and the creek beyond the cabin murmured in its swollen bed. Eleanor rose, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The floor was cold beneath her feet. She poured the last of the coffee from the blackened pot. It smelled bitter, burnt at the edges, but alive. "You move quieter than most," Ethan said, without opening his eyes. She startled, nearly spilling the cup. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He pushed his hat back and blinked into the dimness. "You make that coffee, or did it survive?" The night she handed him the tin cup. "Both, I think." He took a sip, winced, and let a ghost of a smile pass over his lips. Strong enough to tan leather. "Maybe it'll keep you from freezing," she said. He studied her, the hint of humor lingering in his eyes. "You planning on heading back to town when the rain quits? I have nowhere to go." She said it simply, like a fact long rehearsed. "No family left. No money worth mentioning." Ethan set the cup down. His hands were steady, the kind of hands that fixed fences and built walls, but didn't use them to hurt. "You can stay here till you find your feet. I don't intend to become anyone's burden." "You won't. There's work enough to trade for your keep." He gestured toward the window where dawn pressed faint light through the rain. "Fences need mending. Stock needs feed. You can sew. I can do a dozen things that don't require sewing," she said, a spark in her tone. "Then you'll fit fine." She hesitated. "You trust strangers easily, Mr. Hale." He shook his head. "Don't trust easy. Just don't see a reason not to yet." The fire cracked, sending a tongue of light across the floorboards. Something inside her eased. "I'll work," she said at last, "till I've earned enough to move on. Fair." He stood, stretching his shoulders, brushing the low beams of the cabin. The movement was simple, unhurried. He stepped outside into the gray morning. Rain drummed against his coat as he carried a bucket to the well. Eleanor lingered at the door. He moved through the storm as though it were an old friend, head-bowed coat dark with water. The world beyond him was colorless mudwood sky, all one weary shade. Yet in that monotony he seemed the only steady thing. When he came back, he set the bucket near the stove. For washing. "There's jerky in the cupboard if you're hungry." "Thank you," she said. He only nodded, crouching to stir the coals. The fire came alive again, orange and restless. "I was told men out here were rough," she murmured. "Hard, cruel sometimes." "They are," he said, without looking up. "So am I when I have to be." "Then why kindness to me?" He poked the fire. Sparks flared. "Because once someone offered me the same and I was too proud to take it. Paid for that mistake." He stood the firelight, catching a faint scar beneath his cheekbone. "Don't make it yours." She looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I know how to accept anything anymore." "Then start small." He nodded toward the chair near the hearth. "Sit, eat, let the rain do its work." She obeyed. The jerky was tough, the bread stale, but warmth filled her chest. Outside the wind bent the cottonwoods till they moaned. Hours passed slow. She mended a tear in her skirt with a crooked needle she found in the drawer, while he sharpened a knife and checked the rifle's sight. Neither spoke much. The silence between them wasn't cold, it felt earned. By afternoon the storm softened. The air turned silver with drizzle. Ethan stepped out to check the horse, and Eleanor followed, needing air, needing sky. The ground squelched underfoot. Puddles mirrored the clouds, each tremor of wind breaking them apart. The air smelled of sage mud and beginnings. Ethan was by the corral, his hand on the horse's flank, whispering something only the animal could hear. When he turned, there was light in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "You ever seen the plains after rain?" he asked. "No. They shine for a while," he said. "Then the dust comes back. But it's a good shine while it lasts." She smiled faintly. "You talk like a preacher. Just a man who's seen too much go wrong to take right things for granted." The horse snorted, tossing its mane. Eleanor reached out, brushing its neck. It leaned into her touch. "He likes you," Ethan said. "Most things wild do," she murmured. "Until someone tries to break them." Their eyes met his, steady, hers searching, and for a breath neither looked away. The wind stilled. The land held its breath with them. Then he cleared his throat. "Storm will be back by nightfall. You'd best stay another day." Eleanor didn't argue. They went back inside. The cabin glowed with a softer kind of light, now gold from the fire, silver from the window. She hung her shawl near the hearth. He poured what little coffee remained. "To stubbornness," he said, raising his cup. She tilted her head. "That's supposed to be an insult or a blessing. Depends how you use it." She smiled, the first real one he'd seen. "Then I'll call it my salvation." Evening deepened. Rain began again, gentle at first, then heavier, steady as breath. He took a piece of wood and began carving something small, a habit perhaps, or a way to keep his hands busy while thoughts turned. "What are you carving?" she asked. He looked up. "Don't know yet. Sometimes it tells me halfway through." She laughed softly. "That's not how Boston men work. Boston men ever live through a cattle drive. Most wouldn't survive the dust on your boots." That earned her a real grin. "Then maybe there's hope for you yet." She sat closer to the fire, listening to the sound of the knife against wood. The rhythm of it joined the rain's steady pulse. "You said once someone offered you kindness," she said after a while. "Who was she?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "My wife. Long time ago." Eleanor froze. "I see. She died in a spring flood. Same kind of rain as this." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, eyes on the flame. "Ain't sorry that she lived. Just sorry the river took her before I learned how to say what I meant." The fire popped. She could feel the weight of that confession hanging between them. "Loss teaches, if we let it," she said softly. He looked up. "You sound like someone who's learned plenty. Enough to know it doesn't always make you better. Just quieter." Ethan's gaze lingered. "Quieter's not the same as broken." "No," she said, "but it can look similar from a distance." Outside, the storm returned in earnest. Thunder rolled down from the hills and the roof shivered under the weight of rain. Ethan added another log to the fire. "Winds turn north," he said. "Cold'll follow." She helped him bar the door against the gusts. Their hands brushed rough skin, calloused and warm against her smaller one. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. For the first time since her train westward, she felt not hunted by her past, but sheltered by the present. When night deepened, Ethan spread a spare blanket near the fire and handed her his coat. "Take the bed," he said. "You'll sleep warmer there." "I couldn't," she protested. "You've done enough." "I've slept colder places," he said simply. "No use arguing." She relented. The bed smelled faintly of cedar and rain. As she lay down, the sound of the storm wrapped the cabin, a cradle of thunder and water. She listened to his slow breathing from the chair, steady as the rain. Hours later, she woke to quiet. The storm had passed. Moonlight seeped through the small window, silvering his face. He was asleep again, hand resting on the rifle, but peaceful. She watched him for a long while, then whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Morning came clean and bright. The world outside shimmered, every blade of grass jeweled with dew. Steam rose from the earth like breath. Ethan was already outside when she stepped to the porch, shawl around her shoulders. He'd lit a small fire near the corral coffee pot balanced on the stones. "Morning," he said. She nodded, taking in the valley, the meadows soaked in gold, the creek now calm and glassy. "It's beautiful." He poured her a cup. Best kind of morning. The kind that pretends the world never hurt anyone. She took the cup. "And does it last?" He smiled faintly. "Long enough to matter." They stood in companionable silence, steam rising from their coffee sunlight, warming the damp boards beneath their boots. Behind them, the cabin smoked gently, the smell of wood and rain blending into something almost like peace. Eleanor turned to him. "About your offer." He waited. "I'll stay," she said. "For a little while. Till I've earned enough to move on." He nodded once. "That'll do." For now it was enough, their fragile truce against the wild. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and promise, Eleanor thought that perhaps for the first time since leaving Boston, she wasn't running from anything at all. The shelter. By the second day, the road was a river. Water carved its own paths through the red dirt, wild and relentless, until the ruts looked like wounds in the earth. The creek behind the cabin had swollen beyond its banks and swallowed the lower pasture whole. Fence posts disappeared under the brown current, like old bones sinking into time. No horse could pass it now, not for miles. The cabin was an island. Eleanor stood by the window, arms folded tight, her breath faintly fogging the glass. Beyond it, the land was a blur of motion, sheets of rain twisting sideways, the sky pressed low and colorless. Even the horizon seemed to have vanished, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Ethan stacked wood beside the hearth, his movements steady and unbothered. "Looks like we're guests of the weather a while longer," he said. "You sound almost content about it." He glanced up, the corner of his mouth tugging. "Been worse company than thunder." She turned from the window to face him. "You make peace with solitude easily." "Peace don't come easy," he said, adjusting the log tongs. "But if you sit still long enough, it'll find you." She studied him a moment, the patience in his gestures, the quiet acceptance of someone who'd long stopped arguing with the world. "You live alone." "Mostly. A ranch hand rides through when there's work. Otherwise, just me, the stock, and too much sky." "Doesn't it get lonely?" she asked softly. "Not till someone asks," he said, and the faintest smile flickered in his beard. Her own smile surprised her. "Then I apologize for reminding you." "Don't," he replied. "Makes the day talk back." The rain tapped on the roof like knuckles on an old drum. The sound filled the small space, constant, almost tender. They ate stew at the table, beans, dried jerky, wild onions he'd dug up before the storm. It wasn't the kind of meal one lingered over, but it was warm, and it filled the silence kindly. The light from the fire gave everything a soft, forgiving edge. Afterward, Ethan reached into his coat and drew out a battered harmonica. "You mind?" Eleanor shook her head. "I'd rather hear something alive than the rain for once." He lifted the instrument to his lips. The first note came hesitant, a sound too thin to belong anywhere but here. Then the melody deepened, low, unhurried, mournful. It wasn't a tune she recognized, but it felt older than memory, the sort of song that carried dust and distance in its bones. It wound through the cabin like smoke, rising and falling with the rhythm of the rain. For a moment, Eleanor forgot the damp cold, the endless gray beyond the window. She saw instead the trail he'd once ridden, the open land stretching to nowhere, and a man learning to make peace with ghosts through sound. When he stopped, she found her eyes wet. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "It ain't," he said quietly. "Just true." He wiped the instrument clean and set it on the mantel. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what neither knew how to say. Later, when the wind shifted and the roof began to leak near the window, she held the lantern while he worked to nail new boards. His hands brushed hers once. She flinched from reflex, not fear. He pretended not to notice, only adjusted his tone to something gentler. "You got people back east?" he asked after a while. Had she said. "My parents passed when I was 17. My brother married into money and decided that was virtue enough to forget the rest of us. He said I talked too much for a woman, thought too freely for a wife. So I suppose I've been without kin since then." Ethan kept hammering the sound dull against the storm. "Men say plenty of foolish things when they mistake obedience for virtue." Her laugh was soft but bitter. "You sound like you've learned that firsthand." He set the hammer down and straightened. The lantern light carved the scar along his jaw, sharp and pale. "I married once," he said. "Didn't end the way I meant it to." "What happened?" "She got sick the winter. After the war," he said, voice low. "I kept thinking if I worked harder, prayed louder, maybe the world would bargain with me. But the world don't bargain." Eleanor held the lantern higher, watching his face as he spoke. He wasn't weeping, men like him didn't. But there was a stillness in him that spoke louder than grief ever could. She wanted to answer, to offer something in return, but the right words were too fragile to live in that air. So she only said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her then, steady and unguarded. "We all carry ghosts, Mrs. Wade." "Miss," she corrected gently. "And yes, we do." The rain slackened toward evening, its roar softening to a weary hush. A pale mist hung over the valley like breath cooling on glass. Inside, the air smelled of smoke-wet pine and stew cooling in the pot. Eleanor sat near the fire, mending one of his shirts. Her stitches were small and patient, a discipline learned in long winters of silence. Ethan read from a book with half its pages missing his voice, a low, gravelly comfort. "And the righteous shall be like trees planted by the waters." He read the words, rolling out as if he half believed them. "Reckon that's good advice. For folks stuck in floods," he added, closing the book halfway. She smiled faintly. "Maybe it means we're meant to stay till we take root." "Careful," he said, glancing at her over the firelight. "You keep talking like that, this place might start feeling like home." She met his gaze. Would that be such a bad thing? He didn't answer. The fire popped between them, sending a brief storm of sparks up the chimney. They fell into silence again, comfortable, familiar. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in slow, rhythmic beats. When darkness gathered fully, Ethan moved to the door, checking the latch out of habit. He set another log on the fire and paused. "You can rest easy tonight," he said. "No one here means you harm." Eleanor looked up from her sewing. "I know." For a moment, he seemed on the verge of saying more, then thought better of it. The light slid over his shoulders, his rough hands the quiet gravity of a man who'd stopped, expecting fairness from the world but hadn't forgotten how to offer it. She lay awake long after he settled into the chair near the door. The fire had burned low again, glowing like the heart of a patient animal. Rain still whispered on the roof, but softer now, like an old hymn remembered halfway. Somewhere beneath the sound, she thought she heard her heart, remembering how to breathe. By morning the storm had spent itself, but its aftermath was everywhere. The air was raw and clean, the kind that carried the smell of new earth. Fog rose from the soaked ground, curling around fence posts and willows like ghost smoke. Eleanor stepped outside, wrapped in a shawl, boots sinking in mud. The world glistened. Even ruin looked silver under that light. Ethan was already at the corral, fixing a broken gate. His coat was wet to the elbows, hair damp, but he moved with calm purpose. When he saw her, he nodded toward the sky. "Clearing fast. Give it a day or two, roads'll be passable again." She felt a small, unbidden pang at the word passable. It meant she could leave. It also meant she'd have to choose whether she wanted to. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You sleep any a little," she said. The roof stopped dripping near dawn. "That's progress," he said, faint smile ghosting across his face. They spent the morning gathering fallen branches, stacking them for drying. She moved with quiet, competent skirts damp at the hem-hands roughened by work. When she slipped in the mud once he caught her arm. "Careful," he murmured. "I'm fine." But her voice trembled more than she liked. He didn't let go right away. Their eyes met briefly, and something in that gaze, steady, unhurried, made her forget the chill in the air. He released her gently. "You're stubborn, Miss Wade. Wouldn't have made it this far if I weren't." "That's true enough." By midday the rain returned, a light drizzle, more mist than storm. They retreated to the porch. The valley shimmered like glass, the air sweet, with the scent of sagebrush and wet grass. After weather like this, Ethan said, the land always feels new, almost like it forgives us for what we do to it. Eleanor leaned against the post beside him. "Do you believe that land forgives?" He thought a moment. "No. But I like to think it forgets. Maybe that's close enough." Her voice softened. "Would you forget if you could?" He glanced at her. "Would you?" She didn't answer. The question hung between them like smoke too light to rise. That night the cabin was warmer. She cooked this time flatbread from cornmeal stew, reheated with wild herbs he'd shown her how to find. He watched her quietly as she worked, his eyes not curious, but grateful. When they sat down to eat, she said, "You've been kind, Ethan. I don't know how to repay that." "Don't need repaying," he said. "World's full of things we can't square up. Might as well add kindness to the pile." She laughed softly. "That's a strange philosophy." Strange times breed them. Later he reached for the harmonica again. The melody he played was gentler this time, almost hopeful. It carried the faint rhythm of water easing back into its bed of horses settling in the barn. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the sound wrap around her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to move, to flee or fight or prove. She simply was. When the tune faded, she whispered, "Play it again." He did. Outside the night deepened. Inside, two souls sat within the glow of a single flame. The silence between them no longer empty, but alive. And though neither would have dared name it, yet something had taken root in that shelter, a quiet, steadfast thing, born not from rescue or romance, but from the fragile relief of being seen and left unbroken. Eleanor turned toward the fire, her face caught in its amber light, and thought of what she'd said the night before. Maybe they were meant to stay till they took root. Ethan watched her, the steady rhythm of the rain beginning again beyond the window, soft as breathing. "Good night, Miss Wade," he said. She smiled faintly. "Good night, Mr. Hale." He stayed awake a long time after she slept, listening to the rain, wondering when the sound had stopped, meaning sorrow. When he finally closed his eyes, the storm outside had become a lullaby, and the shelter once built only against weather had begun to feel like the beginning of something that might last. The threat returns. 3 days after the storm broke, Red Willow shimmered again under hard sunlight. The earth steamed, and the creek ran high and mean. Ethan hitched the horse at dawn, saying he'd ride to town for salt nails and word of the world. Eleanor stayed behind to sweep the porch, the sound of bristles whispering against the boards. The sky smelled of rain gone sweet. She felt for the first time in months unafraid of the day. The light slanted clean across the meadow, startling bright after so much gray. Steam rose from puddles like the land was giving up its last sigh of the storm. She worked, slow pushing pine needles and silt toward the steps, then knocking clods of dried mud from the rail. A jay hopped along the fence, cocking its head as if taking stock of her progress. Inside, the cabin still held the faint wet wood scent from the night before, but the hearth was swept. The tin plate polished, the 2 cups lined like small sentries on the shelf. By noon she heard hooves, not Ethan's steady rhythm, too fast, too sharp. They clicked off rock and skittered on the damp slope like impatient fingers tapping a table. A rider appeared through the cottonwoods, coat, black hat low. When he dismounted, mud splashed his boots. She knew the stance before she saw the face, a weight thrown forward on the balls of the feet, a chin lifted to angle toward advantage. He moved like a man used to other people's doors opening for him and amazed when they did not. Harland Pryce. "Miss Wade," he said, voice slick as oil. "You left a debt behind." Eleanor's hands tightened on the broom. "I owe you nothing. You owe me my reputation. Word's gone around that I mistreated a lady. My business suffers. My fiancé asks questions. I came to fix that story." He stepped closer, boots grinding gravel. "You'll come back to town, say I was right to refuse you. Say you lied in your letters. I'll do no such thing." His jaw hardened. "Then I'll make sure no ranch in this county gives shelter to a woman with your mouth." The broom handle trembled in her grip. "You'll not threaten me under another man's roof. Another man's," his smile thin. "That what this is now? You playing wife for whoever takes pity." Before she could answer, a voice cut through the yard. "That's far enough, Pryce." Ethan's horse stood at the gate, lathered from the ride. Ethan himself looked carved from shadow eyes, cold shotgun resting easy in his hands. He had mud on his boots and dust on his coat, and calm where most men would have rage. The kind of calm other men learn to respect if they hope to keep breathing. Pryce turned slowly. "This your charity case, Hale? She's a guest. She's a disgrace." Ethan stepped forward. "Then reckon you're standing in the wrong place to judge her." For a long second the air held its breath. Only the creek spoke rushing loud between them. Somewhere down near the bend a hawk screamed. Even that sound faded like it understood better than to interrupt. Pryce's hand twitched toward his coat. Ethan didn't raise the gun. He didn't need to. The steadiness in his gaze was enough. The scar on his jaw catching sunlight, the rifle held like an extension of his intent. "You think you can hide her forever," Pryce spat. "Town'll believe what I tell 'em." Eleanor found her voice. "Then tell them the truth, that a man too small to love a woman brave enough to speak rode all this way to prove her right." Color rose in Pryce's face. "You'll regret that." Ethan moved, then calm and final, placing himself between them. "You leave this ranch now, or I start forgetting how to be civil." Pryce hesitated, eyes flicking from the barrel to Ethan's expression. Then he swung into the saddle, mud flying from his boots. "This ain't done." "Most things worth something never are," Ethan said. The rider turned and thundered off down the ridge, swallowed by sun and dust. Silence fell heavy. Eleanor's breath came quick. Her knuckles were white on the broom. Ethan lowered the gun, setting it against the wall. "You all right?" "I think so." She swallowed hard. "He'll spread lies. Let him. You'll be dragged into it." Ethan's smile was small, fierce. "My name's been called worse by better men." She almost laughed through the trembling. Then the laughter broke into something else, relief perhaps, or the beginning of trust, too deep for words. Ethan tipped his hat back and scanned the tree line as if the cottonwoods might whisper an answer. "He didn't ride alone," he said quietly. "Tracks 2 horses in the willows there. They split off when he came in." He nodded toward the creek. "He brought a witness, or a shadow." "A shadow?" she asked. "Someone who believes he owes Pryce something, or thinks Pryce owes him." Ethan's gaze moved again, restless but measured. Either way, he wanted folks to know he came here. Wanted a story carried clean. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Then we give them a different story." "We will," he said. "But for now, we keep our edges sharp." He took the broom from her and leaned it against the rail. "Come inside." The days still got bite. In the cabin's dim light, Eleanor pressed her palms to her eyes. The coolness steadied her. "I thought I left humiliation on that platform." "You did," he said. "It just tried ridin' back." She lowered her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't thank me for standin' where I ought to." They stood like that for a while, not touching the space between them, warm from the fire and the sun bleeding through the window. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain again. The season wasn't done testing them. But when he set another log on the fire, and the flame rose between them, Eleanor felt the fear lose its edge. She realized then what the frontier truly demanded, not silence, not obedience, but courage, to stay where one had been cast aside. And she wasn't alone anymore. The rest of the afternoon wore a nervous shape. Ethan moved through chores with efficient quiet, but he checked the ridge too often to pretend he wasn't watching. Eleanor filled water buckets, rinsed the stew pot hung shirts on a line she strung between two porch posts. Each ordinary task felt like a small declaration: we are here. We continue. Twice crows barked from the cottonwoods. Ethan's head lifted both times. "Do you expect him back?" she asked finally. "I expect men to do what their pride can't contain," he said. "He came to push. If pushin' don't work, he'll try pullin'. Sheriff's ear, banker's ledger, storekeeper's gossip, whatever buys him distance from shame. Will the sheriff listen?" "Sheriff listens to what keeps peace," Ethan said. "Pryce has a way of making trouble sound like order." Eleanor sat on the top step, hands folded in her lap. "Then maybe we ought to make order sound like truth." He glanced at her, something like approval in the set of his mouth. "That what you did on the porch," took his words and handed them back right side up. She looked down, studying the grain of the wood. "Words are all I have left of Boston. I learned how to live inside them when I couldn't live inside that city." Ethan crouched near the steps, his shadow falling across her knees. "You had more than words, Eleanor. You had spine. Most folks don't know the difference until it's asked of them." She didn't answer. The sun shifted and the field went the color of worn brass. The creek kept talking in its fast, angry voice. Near dusk, a shape appeared on the far rise. Ethan's hand went to the shotgun without thinking. The shape resolved into a man on a roan hat, wide-brimmed, a yellow bandana at his throat. He rode easy reins loose, a hand lifted to show he meant no harm. "Foreman from the North Ranch," Ethan said. "Name's Lyle Carson. He rides honest." Carson stopped at the gate and dismounted. He was younger, up-close face, shaved, clean eyes, the pale blue of winter sky. "Evenin' Hale, ma'am." He touched his hat to Eleanor. "Evening," Ethan replied. Carson glanced over his shoulder, then leaned a forearm on the top rail. Words moving faster than the creek. "Pryce stopped at the Mercantile and a poker table. Said he rode out to warn you you're harboring a liar. Said if the sheriff won't act, the town will." Ethan's jaw worked once. "That his language near enough," Carson said. Men at the table nodded. One of them was Ed Haskin, leans the same way as the wind that fills his pockets. Another was Reverend Bowers. He didn't nod, just looked tired. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Does the Reverend's look matter?" Carson considered. "More than a nod sometimes." He shifted his weight. "Pryce said he came with one other, in case you lied about his coming at all. A fella named Troy Dugan." Carson squinted. "Long arm, scar over the left eye. Plays cards like he's got more fingers than other men." "Dugan rides for anyone with a roll of silver," Ethan said. "A witness who'll sell his own eyes." Carson's mouth twitched. "Well, he sold 'em this afternoon." He straightened. "Some folks are saying the sheriff aims to ride out tomorrow. Not to arrest nobody. Just to see with his own eyes what story sticks." "Sheriff Brannigan?" Ethan asked. Carson nodded. "Ain't a bad man. Ain't a brave one neither when it comes to the likes of Pryce." He looked past Ethan toward Eleanor. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am, but if Pryce wants you back at a platform swallowing words that ain't yours, he'll try to make it happen in front of folks." Eleanor felt the old fear surge, crowd noise, the taste of coal smoke from the station, the hot shame of being measured out loud. She forced herself to breathe until her lungs stopped grabbing at air. "Thank you for the warning," she managed. Carson tipped his hat again. "I ain't saying what's right here, only what's coming. Wanted you to hear it honest." He looked to Ethan. "You need extra eyes tonight," Ethan shook his head. "I'll sit up." Carson swung into the saddle. "Then I hope it's a quiet moon." He rode off along the ridge, the roan's tail brushing flies. The sky was the color of plums by the time his shape vanished into it. Ethan set the shotgun inside the door and took the lantern to the porch. "I'll string a bell line along the east fence," he said. "Just enough to sing if someone tries the gate." "I can help," Eleanor said. He handed her a coil of wire, and together they moved through the last light, the air thick with crickets. He showed her how to fasten tin scraps with loops that would click. If jostled, how to tie the line high enough to catch a man's hip and low enough to catch a man's pride. When they were done, night had taken the meadow whole. Inside, Eleanor poured coffee, hands steadier than she felt. Ethan took his with no sugar, no milk, just heat. He drank and watched the window as if it were a face that might change. You afraid? He asked after a time. Yes, she said, and then surprising herself added, less than I was this afternoon. He nodded like he understood that difference without needing it explained. Fear's a good teacher, he said. It taught me to listen and to load quiet. He set his cup down and reached for his coat. From the inside pocket, he drew a small leather-bound book, edges worn, spine cracked. He held it out. You might find better words in here than anything Pryce can throw. Eleanor took it. Whose is it? Was my wife's, he said. Scriptures and poems. Her handwriting in the margins, notes about water and hope and seed in hard ground. His gaze drifted to the hearth. I ain't opened it in a while. My hands felt too rough. Eleanor cradled the book like it might bruise at a touch. Are you sure I am? He cleared his throat. She believed words could build a house inside a person. I ain't good at building those. Maybe you are. Eleanor opened to a page where a ribbon had been laid. A verse underlined. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Beside it, in a woman's neat hand, due season is never the one I want. It's always the one that arrives anyway. She smiled, a small private thing, and closed the book. Thank you. Near midnight, the bell line whispered the faintest tin kiss in the dark. Ethan was at the door before the second sound. He held up a hand without looking back. Eleanor blew out the lamp and moved to the inner wall where shadow covered her. The creak, swollen and quick, masked any sound they made. The bell kissed again. This time the sound was farther down the fence, a cautious try. Then silence. Then hoofsteps retreating over stone. Ethan stayed at the door a long time after listening with his shoulders. Just watchin', he said when the night gave up its secrets. Just letting us know he can, Pryce, she asked, or a man who wants to be him. Ethan set the bar back in place. Either way, they learned, we ain't sleepin'. The rest of the night passed in bits, coffee cooling logs, collapsing into glowing bark. The creek's voice lowered to a monotone that could lull even a sentry. Eleanor dozed in the rocker with the leather book open across her lap, waking to find Ethan wrapped in his coat near the door, head tipped forward, eyes open anyway. Dawn arrived without ceremony. No pink fanfare, no clean trumpet of birdsong, just a soft graying of the edges, the kind of light that made everything temporarily equal stump fence. Man. Ethan stood and rolled his shoulders. Brannigan will ride in the morning, he said. Pryce will make sure of it. If not today, then the next. We can't live like this, Eleanor said. We won't, he answered. We'll set the story straight where it was crooked. But we do it on our feet, not on our knees. She nodded. The decision moved through her like breath. By mid-morning, dust showed on the south road. 2 riders, one in a tan coat wide as a door, Sheriff Brannigan. The other leaner with a lazy seat and a hat pulled low, Troy Dugan, if Carson's description meant anything. They reined up at the yard's edge. Brannigan put on a face like a lawman in a painting, sober and decent, and vaguely inconvenienced. Dugan's face was the kind men kept when they wanted to see but not be seen. Mornin' Hale, Brannigan called. Miss Wade. He touched his brim to her like she might bite. Mornin', Sheriff Ethan said. He didn't look at Dugan. Harland Pryce says he was threatened on this property yesterday, the sheriff began. Says you menaced him with a shotgun and refused him the courtesy of a conversation. Ethan leaned a shoulder against the porch post. Pryce rode in uninvited to menace someone who ain't his concern. I made him feel the edge of boundaries he didn't recognize. Brannigan's mouth pressed thin. He also says Miss Wade owes him an apology for slander, that she promised herself to him and then, what's the word he used, performed falsehood in public. Eleanor felt her spine harden. She stepped forward before Ethan could answer. Sheriff, I promised no such thing. Mr. Pryce and I exchanged letters. In them I was honest about what I wanted from a life and what I wouldn't abide. He found my honesty inconvenient and called it deceit. When I refused to lower my voice to suit his comfort, he shouted, "That's the whole of it." Brannigan looked at Dugan. You were with him, Troy. What'd you see? Dugan spat to the side and spoke like every word was worth a nickel. Saw Miss Wade on a porch. Saw Hale with a gun. Saw Pryce told to leave. Heard a sharp tongue and a threat. What threat? Ethan asked, voice mild. Dugan scratched his jaw. The kind a man carries without saying it. A shotgun does the talking sometimes. Ethan's eyes didn't move from the sheriff's face. Gun stayed down. Words stayed up. Only thing that rose was Pryce's color. Brannigan blew out a breath. Look, I don't want trouble. Pryce don't want trouble either, not real trouble. He wants a story he can live with. Maybe you can give him one that don't cost anybody blood. Eleanor held the lawman's gaze. The only story I can live with is the truth. Truth's a luxury, and a burden, Brannigan said then, seemed ashamed of how that sounded out loud. What I mean is, folks do better when they ain't forced to pick sides. Pride makes fools of neighbors. Then maybe neighbors ought to learn how not to be fools, Ethan said soft, as a warning. Brannigan's eyes flicked to the bell-lined tin strips and back. You expectin' company tonight, I expect men to be men, Ethan said. The sheriff scratched his cheek. I'll ride back and tell Pryce you ain't breaking bread. Might be he gets tired before you do. He gathered his reins. You watch your shadows. And you, Troy, he looked at Dugan. You keep your mouth shut unless you got something clean to put in it. Dugan grinned without humor. Clean's expensive, Sheriff. Then consider this, a charity, Brannigan said, and turned his horse. Dugan followed, whistling something low and tuneless that made Eleanor want to wash the air. When the dust settled, Ethan let out a breath he'd been holding for hours. He'll go straight back to Pryce, he said. Pryce will turn it into proof. Proof of what Eleanor asked. That his voice still counts more than yours, Ethan said. He rubbed the scar at his jaw with a thumb, a habit when he needed to think. So we answer in a place where voices weigh the same. Where is that, she asked, though she already guessed. The middle of town, he said, with folks standin' who ain't got money in their ears. Eleanor looked toward the ridge where the creek flashed between trees like a strip of hammered metal. She thought of the platform of soot and stairs and the bitter ache in her throat. She thought of Harland's practiced smile of lies, smoothed like river stones until they felt like something you could step on. She also thought of the leather book and the line in the margin about due seasons arriving whether you wanted them or not. I'll go, she said. The words made her taller from the inside out. Not today, Ethan said. He's hot. Let him cool enough to hear you. Tomorrow, when the sun is full and the prize of one more day of talkin' has lost its shine, we'll ride. She nodded. Tomorrow. Pryce didn't wait for tomorrow to press an advantage. Mid-afternoon, when the air lifted with heat, and even the hawks circled slower, a wagon creaked into the yard. Two men sat on the bench, both wearing expressions of hired purpose. In the back lay a tarred barrel and a coil of heavy rope. Ethan stepped off the porch. You lost. The driver held out a folded paper like a shield. Order for a fence repair, he said. Signed, Harland Pryce. Says you told him your south line was down, needed new stakes, set in muddy ground, didn't have coin till Friday. He sent us ahead with credit. Ethan didn't take the paper. South line is fine. The driver shrugged. Then I ain't unloadin' and you ain't payin'. But Pryce'll say he tried to make peace. Ethan smiled with no friendliness in it. You boys water your horses and ride on. If I needed fence, I'd cut pine, not paper. They clicked their tongues and rolled back the way they came, feigning a front they hadn't earned. When they were out of earshot, Eleanor turned to Ethan. He wants to look like a benefactor. He wants to build a stage, Ethan said, and he wants to put us on it. As if to prove the point, near evening, a boy on a pony arrived, breathless, a note pinned to his vest. From Mr. Pryce, the boy panted, said to bring an answer, or a coin. Either one would count. Ethan unpinned the paper. It was written in a hand practiced at contracts to Mr. Hale and Miss Wade. In the spirit of reconciliation, I propose the following. Miss Wade will meet me tomorrow on the platform behind the Mercantile at noon, and state for the assembled townspeople that our correspondence was a misunderstanding. In return, I will refrain from further discussion of her character and withdraw my request to the sheriff for an injunction against harboring a woman who misrepresents herself. If this is agreeable, tie a white cloth to your south fence post before dawn. If not, may God keep you as you prefer to keep yourselves. Respectfully, Harland Pryce. Eleanor read it after Ethan, jaw tightening with each line. An injunction, she said, against harboring me. Harland never met a word he couldn't turn into a cudgel, Ethan said. He handed the note back to the boy. "Tell Mr. Pryce there's no cloth on our fence. Tell him there'll be a voice at noon." The boy looked relieved to have a sentence to carry that didn't weigh more than he did. "Yes, sir. And tell your ma," Ethan said, softening, "not to let you ride after dark." "Yes, sir," the boy said again and wheeled the pony away. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep much. She sat by the fire with the leather book and read the margin notes aloud to keep the dark from thinking it had company. Ethan oiled the shotgun, then set it beside the door and brought in a second chair. He didn't ask if she wanted it. He just put it there, and somehow that was the ask, and the answer, both. "When I was a boy," he said, "at some empty hour my father told me a man's worth is how he stands when there's no shade to hide in. I didn't understand then. Thought worth was cattle or coin. Turns out it's just not reaching for the nearest lie when the sun hits you." Eleanor traced a line of dark script with a fingertip. "My father said power is how many rooms you can enter and remain yourself." Ethan's eyes found hers. "You got a father who knew things." "He did," she said, and the words surprised her by not hurting as much as she expected. The bell line didn't sing that night. The creek lowered by an inch. The coyotes kept their counsel. At first light, Ethan saddled the horse and brought out the wagon. Its boards scrubbed, its harness patched, its wheels greased. He'd put on his better shirt, the one with fewer men's. Eleanor wore a clean dress borrowed from the small trunk in the bedroom, the fabric plain, the collar high. She braided her hair twice and pinned it at her nape. The mirror over the wash basin was spotted, but it showed her a face she recognized, the kind that looks back when you ask something hard of it and nods. "You ready?" Ethan asked. "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." He smiled. "That's the only kind of ready that counts." They hitched the horse, checked the wheel lugs, poured coffee into a tin with a lid. Before they climbed up, Eleanor walked to the south fence and stood for a long breath. The cotton hung slack on the post, gray against gray. She didn't touch it. "Let's go," she said. They rolled down the road to Red Willow, dust rising behind and sunlight climbing in front. The land, freshly washed, had the look of things that might grow if given the chance. Red Willow was awake by the time they arrived. The mercantile door banged. The blacksmith's hammer rang. The saloon piano tinked something raw-boned and cheerful. People paused when the wagon turned onto Main. Pryce stood near the hitching post, coat immaculate again, a smile rehearsed for company. Dugan leaned against a rain barrel, picking his teeth with a sliver of wood. Sheriff Brannigan posted himself by the platform, with the posture of a man hoping gravity might do the work of courage if he stood just so. Ethan pulled up and set the brake. Eleanor dismounted before he could offer a hand. "You wanted a scene, Mr. Pryce," she said. "I'll grant you one." She stepped forward, mud on her hem, eyes clear as the sky after rain. Pryce's gaze skated over her dress, lingering where it could insult without naming the insult. "You told these people I deceived you," she said, voice not loud but carrying, "that I was unfit. But I was only guilty of answering honestly about the world, about myself, about what I hoped for. And you were afraid of all three." Laughter rippled uneasily through the onlookers. Even the piano player stilled his hands. Pryce's smile faltered. "You've got nerve. I'll grant you that. No, sir. I have dignity." "You mistook it for rebellion." Ethan said nothing, only stood at her shoulder, the weight of his silence heavier than any threat. He kept his hat on his head, and somehow that read as honor, not discourtesy. Pryce's temper cracked. "You think the town will side with you? A woman thrown off a train like freight." Eleanor's voice didn't rise. "No, but I will side with myself. That's enough." She turned to the gathered faces, farmers' wives, a few drifters leaning on posts. "Every woman here knows what it is to be spoken over, to be returned, to be told she was too much or not enough. If you remember that, then you know me already." For a heartbeat, the street went utterly still. Then an old woman near the store nodded once. Another followed. Murmurs spread, soft but certain. A boy climbed a barrel for a better view and got swatted down, but he smiled as he landed. The piano player resumed, but quieter, like accompaniment rather than interruption. Pryce opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. Words failed him, not from lack, but from excess. Too many lies to choose among in the time he had. "Your lies won't stick, Harland," Ethan said quietly. "They never do when light hits them." Pryce spat in the dust, swung onto his horse, and rode out with more speed than grace. Dugan watched him go, then looked at Eleanor with a curious tilt of the head, as if measuring a new kind of math. He flicked the sliver away and sauntered after his paycheck, hands in his pockets like he'd invented them. Sheriff Brannigan took off his hat and swiped his sleeve across his brow. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "the good Lord loves a day that doesn't end in a doctor's bill." He nodded at Eleanor, a motion that might one day be courage if it grew. Eleanor stood watching until Pryce vanished into the heat haze. Her hands shook not from fear, but from the release of something long coiled inside her. The tight band around her chest loosened. Air moved in and out like it remembered where to go. Ethan exhaled. "You handled that better than any bullet could have." She gave him a look that was half smile, half exhaustion. "Bullets end things. Words begin them again." The townsfolk drifted back to their errands. The world resumed, but softer somehow. A woman pressed a loaf of warm bread into Eleanor's hand without a word. A farmer she didn't know tipped 2 fingers off his hat. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, was she brave?" Her mother, who'd nodded earlier, answered, "Yes, brave and right." Eleanor heard it, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train, the word home didn't sound like a place, it sounded like belonging. Ethan touched the brim of his hat. "You done what you came for." "I did." She looked toward the horizon, gold with afternoon. "Feels like I can breathe again." "Then let's go where the air's worth breathin'." They left town in silence, dust rising behind the wagon's sunlight, spilling like forgiveness across the plains. The ride back felt shorter. The creek, though still high, had lost its angry curl. Meadowlarks stitched music across the field as if mending a tear in the day. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The sound of the wheels and the horses breathing were conversation enough. Half a mile from the cabin, a scent found them sharp wrong. Ethan lifted his head and sniffed. "Smoke," he said. He stood in the footwell, scanning the ridge. Not chimney, not cook fire. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The barn. They crested the rise and found it not flames, not yet, but a curl slipping from a crack near the eaves, insinuating as a whisper. The door stood ajar. The horse in the nearest stall stamped restless. Ethan jumped down before the wagon stopped and ran. Eleanor followed, skirts, hitched feet sliding in the dust. Inside, the air was thick with the sour exhale of smoldering straw. Someone had jammed a rag under a beam, its end blackening to ember. Ethan grabbed the water bucket and doused. Steam roared up, then hissed away. He kicked the rag free, stomped until the ember gave up its last red eye. He moved with the precise fury of a man who understood how quickly small fires learned ambition. Eleanor hauled a second bucket, sloshing water across the threshold. The horse snorted and backed, eyes wide. She spoke to it without thinking, the words she'd used as a girl in a stable behind the row house. "Hush now. Hush and stand." The horse listened to the steadiness, if not the words. When the last smoke thread was thin as a finger, Ethan straightened. He held the rag up between 2 fingers. The end was charred, but ink still darkened the unburned cloth. "A handkerchief monogram," H.P. Eleanor said. Ethan nodded. "Or a man who wanted us to read it that way." They walked the perimeter of the barn and found the rest of the message in tracks, one set of boots leading in from the cottonwoods, another leading out again at a run. A horse had waited in the trees long enough to chew a bit of bark off a sapling. He wanted a scare, Ethan said. Not a burn. Not yet. Yet, she asked. He looked at the sky, where a single cloud had the indecency to float like a lamp. Men like Pryce turn up the heat when the stew don't taste like they imagined. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. Calm returned to her, not the absence of fear, but its taming. "Then we watch," she said, "and we water the ground around what matters most." Ethan tilted his head, a smile not quite reaching his mouth. "That a Boston proverb, that a frontier one," she said. They fixed the barn door and scraped the scorched straw into a barrel, then spread clean straw like a promise over the stall floors. The horse settled, chewing in long, skeptical motions, as if willing to be convinced. By the time the sun touched the tops of the cottonwoods, the day had found its balance again. Ethan washed his hands at the pump-scrubbing smoke smell from his skin. Eleanor lit the lamp and set bread on the table. The loaf the woman had pressed into her hand, cooling to a crust that cracked clean under a knife. They ate in a quiet that wasn't exhaustion so much as gratitude. When the first stars came, the world felt briefly honest. But out beyond the fence, something shifted a rabbit bolt. A fox slipping home. A man with a grudge, taking stock of his own appetite. The bell line was patient. The creek kept its counsel. The cottonwoods whispered the old things trees say when men are too loud to hear them. Ethan leaned back in his chair and let the day run through him and out again. Eleanor stood at the window, with the leather book open, reading the margin note about seed in hard ground, and the faith it takes to believe in a harvest when your hands are still dirty. "You ever think," she asked, not turning, "that maybe the land is kinder than people?" Ethan watched the lamp's flame make a small world on the table. "Land's honest," he said. "It don't promise what it can't keep." And people, he considered. People are weather. Some days you plant, some days you turn your face and let it pass. Eleanor closed the book. "Tomorrow," she said, and didn't need to say what for. Tomorrow had already learned its lines. He stood and checked the latch. Outside, the dark settled in like a friend who knows when not to talk. Inside, the shelter held. The threat had returned, yes, dressed in a man's fine coat and a witness's lazy grin, in a sheriff's polite caution, and a rag that smoked instead of burned. But so had something else. Something stubborn and unbeautiful and necessary. The kind of courage that doesn't look like thunder, only like staying. The reckoning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Eleanor had made up her mind. The storm had passed, but a different kind of weather had settled in her chest, something that crackled bright and dangerous. She stood at the washstand and poured water into the basin, watching it take the shape of its tin whirl. When she splashed her face, the cold shocked her skin into focus. The woman who looked back from the spotted mirror had lines at the corners of her eyes she didn't remember earning, and a mouth that had learned how not to tremble. She braided her hair tight and pinned it low. She chose the plainest dress from the borrowed trunk, the one that fit best across the shoulders, the one that did not apologize for existing. She buttoned it to the throat and rolled the cuffs twice, practical, unpretty. Ethan was at the corral mending the gate. The light cut clean across his shoulders. He worked with a slow steadiness that made everything else in the world answer to it. Boards were nothing but disagreements that his hands knew how to settle. "I'm going back to town," she said. He straightened, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He took a breath that brought the smell of sun-warmed pine and damp clay and horse. "Not a smart notion, Eleanor. Neither was letting him take my name from me." He met her eyes, calm as stone. "You owe that man nothing. I owe myself the truth spoken where it was stolen." Ethan studied her for a long moment, the way he might study a horse, before untying the rope, measuring courage against risk, asking without words if what stood before him could carry weight. He nodded. "Then, you won't ride alone." He fetched the mare he saved for days that needed answering. The animal's hide shone dark as a wet stone. He ran a palm down her neck, and the mare flicked an ear like she agreed to the errand if the hands held steady. He saddled in silence, checking girth-cinch buckles, not because he distrusted his own gear, but because men who skipped steps paid for it later, in ways they didn't choose. The road to Red Willow was dry. Now ruts baked hard under Sunday. The storm had laid the dust, but the land never kept a clean shirt long. As they rode, the world came up smelling of sage and warm iron. Meadowlarks stitched music across the field. A hawk slung a shadow over them and drifted on. Eleanor sat straight in the saddle beside him, wind tugging at the ends of her shawl. The leather creaked under her. The horse's breathing lifted and fell, a living metronome for the body to match. Somewhere near the creek, bent frogs argued in a chorus that sounded like someone rattling a box of nails. It steadied her more than quiet ever could. Once Ethan said, "Eyes on the road, I believed peace was what came when other men behaved. Turns out peace is what happens inside you when they don't." He shifted his seat easy with the horse. "I'll keep close. But this is your ground to stand on." She nodded. "I know." When they reached the edge of town, the voices drifted from the saloon piano half-tuned, and a laugh that didn't belong to happiness. The blacksmith's hammer beat a steady argument with hot iron. A pair of boys lurched past carrying a crate between them, all knees and brag. A woman swept her porch as if she could scrub the dust out of the world by will alone. People paused to watch. Rumors had outpaced them already. Curiosity leaned out of windows and chewed on toothpicks. Pryce stood near the hitching postcoat, immaculate again, a smile rehearsed for company. The sun flashed off his cufflinks like a man who made Light do chores for him. Beside him, Troy Dugan leaned against a water barrel, eyes hooded, a sliver of toothpick rocking between his teeth, an idle man's pendulum. Sheriff Brannigan had affixed himself to the shade by the mercantile hat pulled low posture, saying he was present but not volunteering for anything the day might ask. The Reverend Bowers stood near the church steps, hands folded in front, as if holding his robes in a wind that never arrived. Ethan reined in and set the brake. Eleanor dismounted before he could swing down to offer a hand. Her boots hit the street and threw up a puff of dust that caught sunlight like gold flour. She walked toward Pryce with the clean directness of someone who no longer made detours for fear. "Well," Pryce said loudly, as if addressing a crowd, even when one wasn't warranted, "look who's decided to show her face." Ethan's breath tightened next to her, and the street went a half-step quieter, as if listening leaned in. "You wanted a scene, Mr. Pryce," Eleanor said. "I'll grant you one." She stepped forward, mud on her hem, eyes clear as the sky after rain. A coal wagon rattled by and then slowed of its own accord, driver watching from the corner of his eye. "You told these people I deceived you," she said, "that I was unfit. But I was only guilty of answering honestly about the world, about myself, about what I hoped for. And you were afraid of all three." The words fell like nails set just so. Laughter rippled uneasily through the onlookers. Even the piano player in the saloon hit a wrong note and let it hang. Pryce's smile faltered. "You've got nerve, I'll grant you that." "No, sir. I have dignity." "You mistook it for rebellion." Ethan said nothing, only stood at her shoulder, the weight of his silence heavier than any threat. His hand hung easy at his side, but there was a whole history in the way his fingers curled, work done, graves visited, doors opened and doors shut. Pryce's temper cracked, a hairline running through porcelain. "You think the town will side with you, a woman thrown off a train like freight?" Eleanor's voice didn't rise. "No, but I will side with myself. That's enough." She turned to the gathered faces, farmers' wives, a few drifters leaning on posts, the schoolteacher with ink stains on her cuffs, the midwife who had delivered 2/3 of the county and half of its hope. "Every woman here knows what it is to be spoken over, to be returned, to be told she was too much or not enough. If you remember that, then you know me already." Her words found purchase where grit lived, in the small places, under the ribs, that remembered humiliation like a taste. An old woman near the store nodded once. Another followed. Murmurs spread, soft but certain. A mother pulled her daughter a fraction closer, and the girl leaned forward anyway, eyes wide. Pryce's mouth worked, but the moment had turned. He could feel it. So could Ethan. Even the sheriff adjusted his stance like a man reluctant to admit the ground had moved under him. "Your lies won't stick, Harland," Ethan said quietly. "They never do when Light hits 'em." Pryce spat in the dust, swung onto his horse, and rode out with more speed than grace. Dugan watched him go with a look that decided nothing, and then decided again to follow the money. He flicked his toothpick sliver into the road and sauntered off at the exact pace of a man who never ran unless paid for it. Eleanor stood watching until Pryce vanished into the heat haze. Her hands shook, not from fear but from the release of something long coiled inside her. The band around her chest loosened. Air went where it wanted. Ethan exhaled. "You handled that better than any bullet could have." She gave him a look that was half smile, half exhaustion. "Bullets end things. Words begin them again." The townsfolk drifted back to their errands. The world resumed, but softer somehow. The blacksmith lifted his hammer and set it down with less anger. The saloon tried for loud, but the tune chose quiet. A woman pressed a wrapped loaf into Eleanor's hands and walked away before thanks could catch her. The midwife's chin lifted a degree, and that was more blessing than most men would ever earn. As they turned to go, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, was she brave?" Her mother answered yes, brave and right. Eleanor heard it, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train, the word home didn't sound like a place, it sounded like belonging. Ethan touched the brim of his hat. "You done what you came for." "I did." She looked toward the horizon gold with afternoon. "Feels like I can breathe again." "Then let's go where the air's worth breathing." They left town in silence, dust rising behind the wagon's sunlight, spilling like forgiveness across the plains. Half a mile out, quiet took on a different texture, the kind you noticed only after you realized you'd been braced for noise. Grass sighed under wind. Crickets sawed their small, hard violins. The creek flashed between cottonwoods like a silver knife tucked into a green belt. "You kept your hands from fists," Ethan said after a while. "That's a stronger kind of fight than most men can manage." "I didn't feel strong," she said. "You were." He flicked the reins lightly, less instruction than conversation with the horse. "You turned a crowd into witnesses. That's the only court that matters in a town like ours." She held the loaf in her lap, fingers pressed into the cloth, as if heat might teach her palms the lesson again. "I thought I'd feel clean after. I feel not clean, just unhidden." "Unhidden's the first clean worth trusting," he said. They rolled down into a shallow dip where the road disappeared and rose again. Sun came at them like a hand blessing and warning in the same gesture. "Do you think he's done?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. "Harland's the kind of man who talks to himself so loud he can't hear anyone else. He'll need to answer the noise." He glanced sideways. "But noise ain't a strategy. It's a symptom. What do we do when the symptom rides back?" "We do what we did," he said. "We don't run, and we don't let him decide which words are allowed to live in daylight." They crested the last rise before the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, a good homely line of gray. Ethan's shoulders eased a fraction. The mare's ears flicked forward as if glad to see what she knew. On the porch sat Reverend Bowers, hat on his knee. The sight of him there, patient as a fence post, surprised them both. He rose when the wagon halted. "Afternoon, Mr. Hale." "Miss Wade." His voice had the shape of Sunday even on a weekday. "I came to say a thing I should have said in town." Ethan set the brake. "You're welcome to say it here." Bowers looked at Eleanor. "I should have stood closer to you back there. The book's got plenty of wrath in it, but the parts we keep forgetting are the ones about widows and strangers and those who fall down under too much burden. I don't know much about letters between you and Mr. Pryce, and I ain't here to arbitrate that history. But I know the look of a soul being returned to herself." "I saw it." Eleanor swallowed. The loaf in her hand suddenly had the weight of something else. "Thank you, Reverend." He nodded, then turned to Ethan. "Sheriff Brannigan is trying to be a dam in a river that don't respect his spy. I told him dams need rock, not wishin'. If he rides out again, I'll ride with him." He huffed a dry sound that might have been a laugh. "That'll either help or make him ride faster." Ethan's mouth twitched. "We'll take either." Bowers put his hat on. "You'll have folks at your door with opinions. Some will hand them to you wrapped like bread. Some will throw them like stones. Keep the bread. Leave the stones right where they land." He tipped the brim. "Good day." When he was gone, the yard took back its ordinary size. Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't known she'd been hoarding. "Reckoning's not always a shout," Ethan said. "Sometimes it's a quiet man showing up where noise lives." Inside, the cabin felt larger than it had in the morning. Sun poured through the window onto the table, like something deciding to stay. Eleanor set the bread down and unwrapped it. The crust crackled and steam rose, the holy smell of flour and insistence. They ate in the accustomed silence of those who hadn't yet learned small talk and didn't miss it. After Ethan rinsed the knife at the pump, while Eleanor washed the plate, each movement a prayer with no word. Late afternoon pulled shadows long across the yard. A dragonfly drilled a shining line above the water trough. Somewhere, a hammer tapped a neighbor, mending what weather had argued with. Ethan checked the bell line, then the barn, then the south fence post where no white cloth fluttered. When he came back, the set of his shoulders had changed. Not hard, just sure. Teach me to shoot, Eleanor said, surprising herself. He paused on the threshold. You don't need a gun to win the fight you picked. I want to know the shape of the other kind. She folded her arms. I want fear to learn some new manners. He studied her another of those long moments that weighed measure against motive. He nodded. All right. They walked to the back of the yard where the cottonwoods broke the wind into tolerable pieces. He brought a small caliber pistol not because it was kind, but because it was honest. The gun fit awkwardly in her hand, at first a foreign weight that wanted to wobble. Not the wrists, he said, stepping behind close enough that his voice reached her skin as well as her ear. Shoulders, back. Your bone is the bench. Your arms are just the legs under it. He showed her how to stand 1 foot sure, 1 foot ready. You ain't fighting the trigger. You're inviting it home. He set up an empty can, and then a sliver of stovewood. The first shot startled her. The report echoed up the creek and came back smaller, like a child practicing its parents' anger. The second shot landed where she wanted it less. The third took splinters off the sliver's edge. Breathe, he said. Don't chase the moment. Let it walk to you. On the fifth, the sliver jumped and spun a coin, flipping. She laughed a shocked sound, head back, eyes bright. There, he said, quiet, pleased. That's the sound of something in you saying, see, I was here the whole time. They shot until her hands learned the shape of steadiness, and his voice wasn't needed. Dusk blued the yard. Bats wrote cursive between tree branches. When they finished, he took the gun back, not as a man reclaiming power, but as a neighbor, handing the broom to someone who'd already proven she knew how to use it. They washed their hands at the pump and sat a while on the steps listening to the creek talk less and the crickets talk more. The day had been a long one of saying what needed saying, and it had the tired look of a field after harvest stripped, stubbled honest. Reckoning, Eleanor said almost to herself. It's a simple word until you live inside it, ain't it? Ethan's voice carried the fatigue of someone who'd run out of pretenses and found that mercy lived somewhere past that border. Most folks think it's a courtroom. Most times it's a porch. What happens now, she asked, not because she wanted an answer with shape, but because the asking made the world feel like it held still long enough to be looked at. Now the story keeps going, he said. Harland will try another move, because that's who he is. He'll hunt where he's already lost. And we'll keep answering, and the creek will keep falling, and the grass will keep remembering it's allowed to stand back up. And us, the word slipped out before she could call it back. It hung in the air between them like a low branch you learn to duck under, then realize later you don't want to. He didn't answer right away. When he did, he didn't look at her. We'll keep noticing what the day brings, he said, and we'll keep noticing each other in the middle of it. They sat until the stars came stubborn as seeds insisting on their own small biology. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, an owl took up its post and announced it with a single, unimpressed note. The night settled on the cabin roof like a hand calming a horse. Eleanor lay awake later and replayed the street, the faces, the exact angle at which Pryce's smile had split. She replayed the moment the murmurs began, the ripple like wind through wheat when the first heads decide to move and the rest decide to remember they're not alone. She replayed the little girl's question and her mother's answer, and when she reached that point, her mind went quiet like a clock that had been running too fast and finally found its true time. In the gray seam just before dawn, she got up and opened the leather-bound book Ethan had given her. She turned to a blank page at the back where his wife's hand had not yet wandered. She dipped the stub of a pencil in thought, then wrote in a careful script, "Today I went to town to look humiliation in the eye." It blinked first. She considered the sentence, then added, "There are things the river takes. There are things it gives back. Today, it returned me to myself." She closed the book and set it back on the table, palms flattening the cover like sealing a promise. When the sun came and spilled itself across the floorboards, the cabin woke small and sufficient. Ethan stirred in the chair by the door, hat slanted, jaw rough with sleep. He looked at her and didn't ask how she felt because the answer was already in the way she held her shoulders. "Coffee," he said. "Please." He poured, and the steam rose like a curtain on the next act. Outside, a jay scolded the light for being late. The creek had lost a little more fury, and gained a little more voice. Eleanor took the cup and wrapped both hands around it. "There's a thing I don't want to forget," she said, "what belonging felt like when I stood near it." "You won't," he said. "It's a seed. It'll keep asking for water." She nodded and then smiled into the steam. Then, "Let's go where the air's worth breathing," she repeated, as if the words were a path laid down by saying them again. They stepped out into a morning that smelled of sun on damp wood, and the small moral of survival: the world did not promise kindness, but it had given them a day where their names belonged to them again. The reckoning had not ended anything. It had begun something else, something that wouldn't need a platform to live, and wouldn't ask permission from men who mistook volume for authority. On the fence post to the south, the cotton string that had waited all night without a flag moved once in the breeze like a head shaking no. Then it stilled, as if it knew its answer had already been heard. Eleanor shaded her eyes with one hand and looked toward the road to town-hazed gold. Somewhere down it, Pryce would be planning a new way to remain the center of his own story. Somewhere down it, people would be telling different versions now, ones in which a woman's dignity had weight in sunlight. She lowered her hand and turned to the work of the day. The porch wanted sweeping again. The gate had a hinge that complained louder than it hurt. The bread needed slicing. The world, having listened for an hour, had resumed its business and asked them kindly to join. Ethan handed her the broom without speaking. It didn't feel like an order. It felt like an offering. She took it, and together they moved into the morning, into the slow, decent labor of standing where they had decided to stand and keeping it. The rain ends. The weeks that followed settled into something close to peace. Spring bled slow into summer. The hills turned from mud to grass, from gray to the pale green that always felt like forgiveness. At Silver Creek Ranch, the work never stopped. There were fences to mend calves, to brand roofs to patch. Eleanor found comfort in it, in the rhythm of honest labor. Each dawn she woke before the rooster pulled her hair back and brewed coffee strong enough to stir a man from the grave. Ethan would be outside by then, sleeves rolled, the morning light spilling over his arms. They spoke little at first, letting the air and the chores speak for them. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the mesa, he found her by the corral repairing a broken gate latch. "You keep at that, we'll have the whole place rebuilt before the year's out," he said. "Maybe that's what it takes," she answered. "Building something that lasts piece by piece." He leaned against the post. "You could have left after the town. Most folks would have. I thought about it." She tied the wire straight and brushed dust from her hands. "But leaving isn't the same as being free." Ethan nodded slowly. "Guess not." The air hummed with crickets. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled, a far, harmless sound. Eleanor turned toward the fading light. "You think storms ever really end?" He smiled a little. "Maybe they just change names." They walked back to the house side by side. The smell of rain still lingered ghost-like in the air. Inside, the table waited with 2 plates of stew, steam rising lazy and kind. As they ate, she caught him watching her softly, as if afraid to disturb what peace they'd built. "What is it?" she asked. "Just never thought quiet could feel this full." Her lips curved. "It's not quiet. You're just listening different now," he chuckled low. "Reckon I am." Later, he lit the lantern and stepped onto the porch. The night spread wide and star-pinned. Eleanor followed, shawl around her shoulders. They stood together, looking out where the land met the sky. The creek murmured below, gentle again. Fireflies blinked near the fence line, small as blessing. Ethan spoke first. "You ever think about what's next, tomorrow or forever, both?" She breathed deep, the scent of sage and wood smoke filling her lungs. "Tomorrow we finish the south fence. As for forever, I'll let the land decide." He reached for her hand, not sudden, not claiming, just steady. "Then we'll build it same as everything else, piece by piece." Her fingers closed around his. "And if the rain comes again, then we'll stand it together." For a while they said nothing more. The porch creaked under their weight, and the wind carried the faintest smell of the first summer bloom. The rain had ended, but its memory stayed in the grass, in the air, in the 2 souls who had learned that survival was only the beginning. Eleanor looked at him, at the faint smile hidden in his beard, and whispered, Feels like living, doesn't it? He squeezed her hand. Finally does. And beneath the starlit sky of Red Willow, they let silence do what words never could, bind them not in promise, but in presence. The morning light, the dawn came soft over Silver Creek Ranch, washing the hills in the color of ash rose and honey. Mist lifted off the grass like breath, leaving a sleeping world. Eleanor stirred before the rooster, bare feet touching the cool floorboards. She stoked the fire, poured water into the kettle, and waited for it to hum. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of a hammer, the sound of Ethan mending the east fence before breakfast. It was a sound she had come to trust, the proof of another heartbeat near her own. She stepped out with 2 cups of coffee. The air smelled of dew and smoke. Ethan turned as she approached, smile half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "You beat the sun again," she said. "Sun's got no choice but to catch up." He took the cup from her, their fingers brushing. Steam curled between them, rising into the chill. Across the pasture, calves called for their mothers, and the creek flashed like a silver thread through the meadow. A red hawk wheeled above them, silent against the brightening sky. Eleanor leaned on the rail. "Funny," she murmured, "how quiet feels like company now." Ethan nodded. Guess quiet just needed a voice worth sharing it with. They worked together the rest of the morning, tying wire, setting new posts. Laughter surfacing in small bursts, like sunlight between clouds. When a nail bent, he cursed softly. When she straightened it with a twist of her wrist, he just grinned. The day unfolded the way good days do, slow, unhurried, full of use and grace. By noon, the fence stood straight again. Eleanor wiped her brow and looked toward the horizon. Rain clouds gathered faintly far off, harmless as memory. Ethan followed her gaze. "Looks like weather's changin'. It always does," she said. "But it leaves the land greener." He reached for her hand, rough, sun warm, certain. "No more runnin' then." She met his eyes. "Not unless we're ridin' the same way." He laughed low and content. They stood there, fingers entwined, the wind tugging at their clothes, the scent of wet earth rising around them. Behind them, the cabin door stood open, a thin column of smoke curling from the chimney. Inside waited the half-finished pot of stew, 2 plates, and the sound of a home being lived in. Eleanor pressed her head lightly against his shoulder. The horizon shimmered gold. The morning light caught them there, 2 souls once cast aside, now steady, as the fence they'd built together, bound not by promise, but by the simple, stubborn act of staying. The wind carried their silence across the wide plain, mingling it with the smell of coffee pine, and a life finally mended. And somewhere beyond the ridges, a new day rode in.